This is Radio TV Phono Nut, and we're going to go at this a little bit differently than we've gone in the past, in that we're going to start with a schematic of what we're going to be working on. This is a little Grunow model 564, 5-tube superhet AM radio from about 1936 or so. And this is one of those goofy kind, like some of the others from that period, that has the volume control in the front end circuit of the radio. We have a 6A7 for an oscillator and mixer, and then we have a 6D6IF, a 76 detector and first audio amp, a 41 for a power output, and then we have a Type 80 rectifier. Now this radio came to me non-working, and whenever I fired it up, we had 120 cycle hum that sounded like bad filters and no reception, which I will demonstrate shortly. Now, I remember a good many years ago fixing up a tombstone Grunow for someone that had a similar circuit as this one, and on that one you had to turn the volume control about 3/4 of the way up to get anything. And then whenever I returned it back to the flea market for them to give back to the owner, then the flea market lady contacted me and told me the owner couldn't receive anything on it. And I said, tell him he's going to have to turn it about 3/4 of the way up. And if he lives in a rural area, then he's probably going to need a long wire antenna. And I suppose she told him, and he followed my instructions, because I never heard anything out of him. So, now one other thing about this radio that is common to a lot of 30 sets that confuses people is this has a filter capacitor with a common positive connection, whereas in most of the newer radios and in some older radios the filter capacitors have a common negative, but this one has a common positive. And that tends to confuse people sometimes, and they wind up putting the filter capacitors in backwards and end up blowing them up. So let's go fire this radio up, and I'll show you what kind of problem it has. Thus far, the only servicing I can tell that has been done to this radio is someone has replaced the power cord with one that's obviously newer than the radio. I haven't pulled the chassis yet to see what may have been done underneath, but we have the radio plugged into our 100-watt incandescent bulb, and we'll now turn it on and I'll let you hear what it does. So the bulb is glowing very dimly. Now we have reception.
There's a void. I meet some Aggies,
along with a lot of popping.
Same thing, but around politics.
Probably a paper cap trying to short.
We love our...
Seems to have pretty good tonal quality.
The Express.
We try.
Radio. I just want to throw that disclaimer out.
Well, this may be a fairly... Here's the chassis pulled out, and I know the filter cap has been replaced at some time, because there's the hole where the original chassis mounted cap would have gone. And this has a nice 8-inch speaker in it, which is a bit unusual for a little table radio like this. Now let's flip it upside down and see what the underside looks like. Well, it looks like someone has done a recap on this relatively recently, and we can see that this has newer style electrolytic capacitors in it, but we still have 120 cycle hum. So that makes me wonder, have these capacitors failed, or did somebody wire them in incorrectly? Okay, I did some eyeballing while the camera battery was charging, and I believe I've located the problem. But before we look at that, we'll look at exactly how this filter capacitor is connected. We have the two positive terminals connected together, and that's connected to our cathode of the rectifier, which provides B+ voltage to the various stages of the radio. And then we have one of our negative terminals of the capacitor connected to chassis, and then we have the other negative terminal of the capacitor connected to the center tap of the high voltage winding on the power transformer, and that center tap also goes up here and connects to one lead of our speaker field coil, and also on that line we go over here to this resistor network here that provides bias for the output tube, and then on the other terminal of the field coil that connects to chassis. Well, I've done some looking, and whoever replaced those filter capacitors connected both of the negative terminals to chassis, so in essence we don't have an input filter here. We just have two filter capacitors in parallel connected to the chassis, and that's the reason we have the hum that we were hearing. This is what my 8th grade math teacher would have referred to as a careless mistake. I know I was having problems in math during that time, and I was often staying after school to get help after I would bomb a test or not do as well as I should have on it. I might not have outright failed it, but I could have done better, and we'd be going over my answers, and some of them I would be looking at and saying to myself, well, sometimes I said it out loud, I can't believe I did that. And my teacher was like, it's not that you don't know the material, it's just you're not paying attention and you're making all of these nutty, careless mistakes. And that's the reason you're not doing good on the test, because when you sit down with me, you're proving to me that you can do the material. You just need to learn to pay better attention to what you're doing. And I believe that's probably what happened here. Somebody likely went through this radio like a bull in a china closet, recapping everything like seems to be common practice, and then whenever they turned the radio on, it hummed, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong, or they got frustrated or whatever, and they just put it back together, and it sat on the shelf for a while, and then got donated to Goodwill whenever they were cleaning out. So that's most likely what happened there. So the lesson is pay close attention to your work and try not to make any mistakes. And this is another reason why I just don't like to go full force on recapping a radio, because if I recap the whole thing and then I discover a problem that wasn't there to begin with, then I'm having to chase my tail for potentially hours trying to figure out what I did wrong. Whereas if I take it one stage at a time, as in power supply, make sure that's working, audio stage, make sure that's working, and then if I run into a problem somewhere along the way, then I kind of know what area to look in. And I apologize for the lack of lighting in here due to inclement weather. It's not very conducive to go outside today. But looking here, our positives of our filter capacitors are tied together. That's like they're supposed to be. And then one of our negative filter capacitor terminals is connected to chassis. That's where it's supposed to be. But if we look at this other negative filter capacitor terminal, they have it connected to the lug on the terminal strip that connects to chassis. So I trace the field coil back. This is not good, I know. And our green wire from the field coil connects to chassis like it's supposed to, and then we trace our black wire over here, and it connects to this first lug on the terminal strip, so someone just made a slight oversight, and instead of connecting the negative end of this filter capacitor to the first lug, they connected it to the second lug that connects to the chassis. And something else I noticed here is they use some audio grade capacitors here. I hope that was just a case of them having some capacitors that they got in a junk box or something, and they didn't go out and spend money on audio grade film capacitors to put in this radio, because I'm here to tell you it's not going to make one iota of difference in performance. The only thing it's going to do is deplete your wallet size faster. In fact, I'm really not so sure how much difference they make in performance when used in an actual high-fidelity amplifier. In my mind, a capacitor is a capacitor. And a lot of this, in my opinion, is just what you'd call snake oil, but a lot of the audio fools fall for it. But there just wasn't any need in putting expensive audio grade caps in this radio. As far as the workmanship, it looks pretty good. Everything looks like it's soldered up and all that, so I'm probably not going to rework any of that. I'm just going to correct his wiring error here and see how the radio performs. And before we do that, I'm going to get on a bit of a rant about shipping. A few days before Christmas, a friend called to let me know that he and his mother were sending me some candy and treats that they had made for me for Christmas, and that it was supposed to arrive via UPS on Christmas Eve. So I said, okay, I'll be watching out for it then. Well, normally I get an email from UPS the day before delivery is scheduled, letting me know that a package is coming. And then I also get an email the morning of, letting me know that the driver is on the way. I didn't get neither one, but on the day before Christmas Eve, my friend called to tell me that, well, it looks like your package is still on track for tomorrow. And I said, okay, well, I'll be waiting around for it. Well, Christmas Eve came and went, and it didn't show up. So I talked to my friend the day after Christmas, and I said, well, I've got bad news for you, but the package didn't show up. And he said, well, I was wondering, because when my mother checked the tracking number, it said delivered at, I believe he said 12:17 p.m. on Christmas Eve. And I said, well, it might have been delivered somewhere, but it wasn't delivered to this house. Well, there's a lady that lives on the other street that has the same house number as mine and a similar street sounding similar. The name of her street is similar to mine, and she has gotten my packages before, and I've gotten her packages before. Thankfully, we're both honest. So normally I wouldn't call her, because I've got sense enough to know that if something came to her house for me, then she would have called me. But I got to thinking, maybe she went out of town for Christmas. So I called her, and she said, no, I've been here the whole time, and there haven't been any packages delivered to this house, so who knows where all my Christmas goodies wound up. And it just basically all boils down to incompetence. I think during the holiday season, they hire these subcontracted drivers. He was probably ticked off because he had to be out delivering packages on Christmas Eve anyway, so there's no telling where my Christmas package got dropped off. Which brings up another point. Obviously, a lot of people today are not as honest as me and the lady on the other street are. You know, they have something delivered to their house, even though it doesn't have their name on it. They're going to keep it and keep their mouth shut about it. I know about 30 years ago, somebody that my mother worked with had a package delivered to his house in error, And whenever the UPS driver realized his mistake, he went back to retrieve the package, and the guy wouldn't give it to him, claiming that, well, by law, I don't have to return anything that's delivered to my house. And actually, I think where he's confused is he doesn't have to return anything that's delivered to his house with his name on it. If it has somebody else's name on it, then that's a different story. Well, I believe it actually got physical between him and the UPS man, and the cops were called, and the cops made the dude give the UPS driver the package back. And then my mother ripped the guy a new butthole and basically let him know that if the shoe was on the other foot and it was your package that was misdelivered to somebody else, you'd be raising hell if they wouldn't give it back. So that's where we are. That's where we went with that. And in the post office, there was something I ordered weeks ago, and it made it from its destination to Memphis in 2 days, and it just went poof. That's the end of it. No trace of it. And all I see when I check tracking is in transit to next facility, arriving late. And I'm thinking, well, I've already figured that much out, but where's the next facility? Tacoma, Washington? That same friend that sent the candy to me had that happen with something he ordered from, I believe, Florida. Instead of it going to West Virginia, it went to Washington State and then came back to Florida, West Virginia. So no wonder the post office is in such bad shape. Look at how it's being ran. And something else that irritates me is, I'll just say, my dad was a diehard union man, and you didn't go against the union unless you wanted him to write you off. I'm 100% for the unions, standing up for those who do their job properly and are hard workers, but when you have these slouches that have the attitude of, well, I don't have to do a good job, I can goof off because I've got union protection, they can't fire me, then that's where I have a problem. And those kind of people need to be let go. Alright, enough ranting, let's get the capacitor moved over and see if this thing will play. Okay, we have the capacitor moved to its correct terminal in the circuit, and we're almost ready to run the smoke test. Now, that's not the cleanest install, but right now I'm not really aiming for neatness. I just want to get the radio to play to some degree of normalcy, and then maybe some other time we'll tear this back apart and do a more thorough going over of this. All right, let's run the smoke test. Okay, power on. Bulb got a little bright, dim back down. We're not hearing that initial hum that we heard before when we turned the radio on. And the bulb is moderately bright.
They do have a couple of Super Bowls, so they're more than a couple of Super Bowls to their credit, but this, of late, maybe things haven't gone as well. Raiders, Cowboys, Browns, Jacksonville, Carolina, Atlanta, Saints, and Dolphins. That's a lot of names. It is. It is. And I don't know if I agree with all of the teams that Wes is saying, but I have to admit what Wes is saying is something that I thought of, and I have thought of, is there are organizations that don't have these problems because of ownership. What goal is to always may not be the case. At least they're not as dysfunctional and crazy. Now, sometimes some of the players can be, like Antonio Brown pulling his antics. Yeah. But there's usually
trying to find out where that popping's coming from.
And yeah, this is the stuff that happens with the Bears. This is the stuff that happens with the Jets. This is the stuff that happens with the Dallas Cowboys, and it goes all the way to the top. It actually warms my belly to hear
fans actually being aware that it's not always the player. Organizationally, if things aren't
And what is that?
All those things aren't bad organizations, aren't badly run organizations, right? So I think there is a fine line that comes with it.
Okay, we got rid of the hum, but our sensitivity is not what it should be, and it's very bad at the high end of the dial, and we still have this intermittent popping. I can tap pretty much anywhere on the chassis and make it act up. So that might be kind of difficult to trace down.
Spending time with loved ones.
Okay, the metal storm window makes a good antenna.
Caring for a loved one may
get rewarded with a $200 phone credit after 12 months. It's a win-win.
I remember that Grunow tombstone that I fixed. Even though it was a 5-tube superhead, it just did not have the sensitivity that you would think one would have. It was basically just a city radio.
You can easily find coverage options that fit your...
From Mount Jim's polarized sunglasses. We invite you to come by and experience care the way it should be. Professional, courteous, and caring. Grace and Optical on 25 by Mattress Firm.
Yeah, we're getting WLW 700 out of Cincinnati. With help from the window as an antenna.
When you want a haircut, Super Cuts will help you get that fresh cut feeling.
That's something very weak.
Downtown Meridian. Award-winning quality.
Alright, I may have found the intermittent popping. I have the chassis flipped upside down and I'm wiggling every component that's been replaced. And whenever I press on this capacitor here that's on the volume control,
I always want them to have that or what statement because the person
you can hear it lose his audio.
Is going to want to know.
So that's at least one problem that needs to be fixed.
You sit down with your husband and say, if we don't go to marriage counseling by the end of this weekend, or we don't have a date on the calendar by the end of this weekend, and it's next week, and if you don't go, here's the or what. Me and our daughter are moving out. Period. You just have to be prepared for the or what, because the or what comes with a lot of complexity. And I know it sounds super cool to be like, you can Google this, and on these stupid websites they're going to tell you like, that sounds all well and good.
And I hope that that's a bad solder connection and not an intermittent volume control. You mean after all this time, it sounds like they're still talking to that woman?
How much money?
Well, I resoldered that, but it didn't seem to help any.
Can't spend if you even.
So that may mean we have an intermittent connection at the volume control terminal itself.
Do you have any kids?
I did make a vow to him.
I think at some point in time I would like to go in here and clean this up a bit. It's like that capacitor right there. That lead is a little bit long. It's not insulated. It could very easily short out to something else. I think we could shorten that a little bit.
I don't want to weed this
in these filter caps.
Situation.
Although this is technically not too bad, but what I would probably do is, since we have room here, just put a terminal strip on the front of the chassis and just put the filter caps there.
Even the way you started the call, he told me I haven't proven my, just those words alone let me know this is water to you.
And it could be that this capacitor has an intermittent internal connection. Just because it's a later model capacitor doesn't mean that it doesn't have a defect.
Their autonomy and their ability.
But that'll be easy enough to check. Just clip a known good cap across it and wiggle it, and if it doesn't go away, then that capacitor is intermittent. Okay, I may be seeing something here with our poor lighting.
You'll have that paid off in no time.
Looks like there might be a big blob of solder on that center terminal of the volume control, and then whenever I press on this capacitor, that moves it just enough to make contact with the other terminal and sort the signal out to ground.
You're being allowed to give your all because the
now, me personally, I don't think I would have whatever it takes to call in on a nationally heard radio call-in show or appear on some TV talk show and air my marital problems, my relationship problems to the world.
Now, I will never. And
if I was in a toxic situation, then
I'm going to go move in with a friend.
I realize it can be difficult at times, but I think I would just get out of it and be done with it. Okay, well in this case, it looks like the volume control wiper is connected to ground. And then that capacitor connected there connects between the cathode of our oscillator and mixer tube to ground, and they're using that center terminal on the volume control as a convenient tie point. Okay, I've got this volume control partially out where I could expose the terminals. This here was just tack soldered onto the center terminal, which is a good thing for easily disassembling something, but it's not a good thing for a secure connection. You should never rely on the solder to provide a secure connection. You should rely on a good mechanical connection to make your secure connection to a terminal, and then you just use the solder to, for lack of a better term, bond it in place. And if you just tack solder it on, eventually with vibration and whatnot, it's just going to crack and make intermittent contact or break loose completely. Another thing I'm seeing, there's a green wire on the bottom terminal that goes to the antenna coil, and on the schematic it shows nothing on that bottom terminal of the pot, so we're going to have to see about that too. Use the desoldering braid to clean these terminals off, and I can tell you by that connector, that solder blob where they had the wire from the antenna coil on that bottom terminal, that's definitely not fact. Alright, that antenna coil lead there is supposed to go to ground. That's the bottom end of the primary windings. We're going to put that on the center terminal along with this other stuff that came off of it. And this pot may be a replacement, because as I'm trying to get all this crap off of here, that looks like an old terminal from a previous potentiometer that was here, and they just tack soldered it onto the new terminal. But we're going to get that crap off of there and do it more correctly. And this top terminal, some crusty crap that's just tack soldered on too, so we're going to fix that more correctly. Okay, I got the control back in there. Let's see if any improvement is noted. I'm getting very weak reception, just like what we got before. and that's not good. Well, oddly enough, when I disconnect the storm window for an antenna, it gets slightly better, and I have the volume control jumped out, which should make it full on, and that's as good as it gets. Now, when I bring my hand close to the antenna coil,
and Congress grows wealthier by the minute.
It really cranks up. Okay, well, the last guy got his wires crossed on the filter cap, and it looks like I got mine crossed on the antenna coil here and the volume control. If you remember when I showed you on the schematic, one end of this volume control connects to nothing, and then whenever I pulled it out here, I discovered this green wire from the antenna coil that looks very original to the radio, was soldered to the bottom terminal on that volume control, and I just assumed that was the ground wire, and so I soldered it to the center of the volume control that's supposed to be ground. Well, I looked down through the top of the antenna coil with my light, and our antenna lead connects directly to this green wire here, and I confirm that with the ohm meter. I get a dead 0 ohm short. So, and then whenever I read between our antenna wire and the chassis, I read about 28 ohms now. So we're going to connect this wire back up to the bottom of the volume control where it was originally and see if that helps things any. Now, before we had such blobs of solder on both connections on the volume control that it would be very easy for the center pin and the bottom pin to short out to each other, which was basically causing the problem we had. And what led me just now to look at this problem is because whenever I touch my hand to the secondary winding of the antenna coil or to the lead going from the antenna coil up to the tuning capacitor, then our reception improved. So that told me that the problem most likely had something to do with the primary winding of the antenna coil. And another way I know this volume control has been replaced at some point is the hole in the chassis is a bit bigger than the diameter of the volume control shaft thing, whatever, that the nut screws on. The original volume control would have been just the right size to go through the hole in the chassis. Alright, it's in the process of warming up, and we'll soon know what's going to transpire here. Now, that sounds a little better. Yeah, that's more like it.
ZipRecruiter, get a quality candidate within the business. Let ZipRecruiter do the work finding the best people for you.
Alright, let me press on this capacitor and see if it goes dead now.
Power of ZipRecruiter for free. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com.
It does not, so apparently what I just said was taking place. There was enough solder blobs on those two terminals that whenever I was pressing on that capacitor, it was making contact, and then whenever I tried to resolder those terminals without pulling the volume control out where I could still see it, it just bridged the terminals together. Alright, I've got it off the dim bulb now. I don't think there's any danger of anything blowing up, so.
LibertyMutual.com.
Trying to, the faithful steel needed today.
Okay, at a later date we'll go back in this and try to clean it up some, but possibly improve its performance a little bit, but I think I've done about all I want to do with this thing for right now. And I really wish they'd have made these speakers unpluggable. That way you could put the speaker back in the cabinet and then slide the chassis back in and plug the speaker into the jack on the back of the cabinet. But this is hardwired in, and they don't give you a lot of lead length, so this one's probably going to be a bit of a pain in the butt to get back together again. And I can tell you the dial in this thing is a repro dial. It's way too nice and shiny to be an original dial, and I know Radio Days sells a reproduction of this, and we can tell that somebody has it installed with a piece of clear packing tape, which we'll have to do a better job at that down the road. Probably staple it in place or thumbtack it in place. Alright, let's try to get it back together and hope it'll still work whenever we're done. Alright, I got it back in, but I'm going to tell you, when I take this back apart to work on it correctly and get it working as best as it is capable of working, which may not be much better than what it is right now, we're probably going to put some longer leads on this speaker, and we're probably going to put a Molex plug on it with some kind of B+ interlock jumper, so if the radio is unplugged, or the speaker is unplugged from the radio chassis, then it will disable the power supply, because it would have been a whole lot easier, like I said, had they just had an unpluggable speaker with a plug on the back of the chassis or on the top of the chassis like what most of them had. And then you could just unplug the speaker from the chassis, separate the chassis from everything, and it would just make everything that much simpler. Alright, here we are, and I'm connected to the storm window for an antenna again. Turn that up a little bit for try to get some distant stations here.
Get on our list. Get prepared and knock it out of Service Committee. We were given a loan from President Reagan of Marine One. We need in the financially reporting stuff in there. I'll play around. I think focus on the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We just mentioned Eddie Arnold.
Well, there's WSM, so at least we can get that.
Do that right after the break. I'll leave you up until midnight. My name is Jeff Hogue.
And that was wide open.
On the Opry Plaza inside the Royega House. Back into it before you know it. WSM.
Okay, now, so what kind of stupid crap you trying to do? Sounded like it was trying to go into oscillation there. That sounds like a tube that's intermittent.
Call us if you have a request, birthday, or anniversary on the praise line. 601-482-0910. We're Praise 95.9 FM, 910 AM. Prize Picks, the best place to get real money action. Your favorite sports with over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings. Really, two or more players across any sport. Pick more or less on their projection, and you can win up to 200 times your money. Join now because this holiday season, Prize Picks is giving away 2 free.
Alright, I pulled the detector in first audio tube, and we have a little more 120 cycle hum now that I'm feeding it full voltage. And it's still doing all that carrying on, and whenever I tap the output tube, that seems to be the problem. Alright, I borrowed another output tube to put in this set, and now I can tap on it and it doesn't pop and go berserk, but we're getting some interference from somewhere here. All that popping. So, is it being generated within this radio? Or is it being generated outside and receivable on other radios? So we have another radio plugged in next to it. And we're hearing the interference on it, but not as bad as on the Grunow set. So what I'm going to do is turn the Grunow set off and see if it goes away on this set. So let's turn the Grunow off. Okay, we're still hearing it on this set. So it's not being generated within the Grunow, it's somewhere else, but the Grunow seems to be more sensitive to it. There's WSM coming in, but we can't really enjoy it because of all of its garbage. Alright, let me unplug this old RCA black and white TV. That's where it's coming from. The television is turned off, so something is arcing somewhere, and I know these older RCA sets had issues with some of them had issues with the power switch arcing and burning up, and I know also the across the line cap in this set is not switched, it's in circuit as long as the set's plugged in, if I remember correctly. So we might have just averted some disaster here.
This WSM at night with
let's leave that on a weak station, plug the TV back. Okay, TV's not plugged in. TV's plugged in and we got more noise now. Unplug the TV, noise goes away. Let's turn the TV on. Turn it off, more noise. Turn it on, which closes the power switch, less noise. So that's probably not the across the line cap. That would seem to be an issue with the power switch. Turn it off, we're hearing noise. Unplug the TV, noise goes away. So that's probably why it's a good idea. You heard Shango mention it before as far as not leaving this old stuff plugged in. And normally that TV is not left plugged in, but I didn't unplug it a while ago after I watched it. And had I not had this radio working on it next to the TV and heard all the interference, then something could have happened that we didn't want to happen, and likely in the middle of the night whenever I was asleep.
Individuals from other countries, they send their money back home. So then
I mean, there's still something going on there, but it's not nearly as pronounced as it is when the TV is plugged in. This radio does have a nice sound to it. Let's kind of go through the band before we call it a night.
Even bigger, so I'll give away more. They want to exponentially.
Show.com. That's RedEyeRadioShow.com.
Winners here, and your diesel game was okay. Third quarter was close. I think it was 16-10 mid-third.
Listen carefully. If you owe over $10,000 in back taxes or
Had a cold. The calls exploded.
plan, and you know what? Kudos to him for doing that. Tom Holman.
Because processes like this, and we all go through this.
WDIA.
To try to manipulate the human.
Brings them out.
Alright, we're getting some out-of-town stuff on here. So, one day down the road, we will pull this back apart and do a little cleanup on the previous work and do an alignment on it and all that. And it ought to be in good shape.
Either. Now they're graduating from those types of things to murder.
This set here really is one that will work better with an outdoor antenna if possible.
Still a plan we have.
Okay. As far as the way this potentiometer is wired, the way they have it shown on the schematic is how it's wired in my radio, for the exception of on the schematic they omit the connection between the antenna and the bottom end of this potentiometer. So, when you have the radio turned wide open, it takes the antenna lead further away from ground, and it places this into this 150 ohm cathode resistor on the oscillator and mixer tube closer to ground. And then whenever you turn the volume all the way down on the radio, it pulls the antenna lead close to ground, and then it pulls this 150 ohm cathode resistor further away from ground. I don't know whether the fact that little circuit modification is not shown on this schematic, I don't know if that's because this schematic was drawn in error or if that was a later modification to that particular chassis. So just to recap what took place, we were greeted with a radio that had 120 cycle hum that led us to believe the filter capacitors were bad, but whenever we removed the chassis, we discovered that the capacitors had been replaced, but someone had miswired one of the capacitors. They had connected it to chassis when the negative terminal of that capacitor should have been connected to one end of the speaker field coil. And then whenever we made that correction, we got rid of most of the hum, but we had intermittent popping and carrying on. And as it turned out, we had two separate problems that were causing intermittent operation. Number one, we had the sloppy soldering on the volume control pot, and number two, we had the output tube that was intermittent, and I think the intermittent output tube was causing our first sign of popping and intermittent operation. It's just we didn't discover the bad connections on the volume control until I started wiggling things under the chassis. And then after that, I made a boo-boo and connected our antenna lead, basically shorting it out to ground at all times because I wasn't paying attention to what I was doing either. So that just shorted our incoming signal to ground, and what little bit we were picking up from the radio was being picked up by the secondary winding on this antenna coil here. But we do need to go back in the radio at a later date and do a little bit of cleanup and going over some solder connections. Like I said early on, this is not the worst recap job I've ever seen, but it's really not up to my standards, and I would like to clean it up a little bit. And then we need to touch up the alignment, and that ought to do it. I am impressed that Grunow took one of their obviously lower end radios and put a nice 8-inch speaker in it, which is something you rarely see from the other manufacturers. That's not a brand name that I've ran up on very much. In fact, the only other one I believe I've encountered was that one that I fixed for somebody. But I have seen pictures of some Grunow radios, and it appears that they made some pretty fancy ones as well as some cheaper ones like this one is. I think that was probably a brand that wasn't really common in my area. Well, in fact, this radio didn't come from my area. If I had to depend on what comes out of my area to have a collection, I probably wouldn't have near as much junk as I do. I don't know when exactly Grunow went belly up, but I think they were probably done by I think they were probably out of business by the end of the 30s. I don't think they were around after World War II ended. So I think I've about covered everything. Oh, and we need to find a 41 output tube. I borrowed a 42 out of another radio, which is just a beefier tube. It'll work for testing purposes, but I want to put the 42 back in the radio in which it came out of and come up with a 41 to put back in there. And a 41 is just an older version of the later octal-based 6K6, so if I can't come up with a 41 here somewhere, I can just remove the bulb from the existing base and wire an octal socket to it and plug a 6K6 into it, and the radio won't know the difference. Okay, well, I guess that's about all I've got for now. I hope everybody had a Merry Christmas, and I wish everybody a happy 2025 if I don't happen to jump back on here before then. I don't know about the rest of y'all getting ready to enter 2025, and I was just now getting used to the 1980s. Okay, I guess we're not quite through with this yet. I did a little more playing around with this, with the interference off the camera on the night that we were having the interference, and I noticed when I listened carefully, when I unplugged the television, the interference was still there. It just wasn't as pronounced. So I'm thinking now that the fault might not have been with the television. It might have been that we had some interference riding on our electrical wiring, but whenever I plugged the TV in close proximity to the radio, the power cord from the television may have been acting as an antenna that was radiating the signal. And then tonight I plugged the radio in, and no matter whether the TV's plugged in or not, I still get the same amount of interference. So there's probably nothing wrong with the television. Probably whatever it was something that was riding on the AC lines and being picked up by the radio. Now the other radio that we were using as a test that the interference was noticeable on was not as severe as it is on or was on this one, and that's probably because the Grunow radio does not have a noise suppression capacitor on the AC power line, but the Sonora radio does have a suppression capacitor, and that could be what's having some effect on it too, the reason the Grunow radio was more severe. And what's this continuous loop I'm hearing on 1010? Could they be stunting? Could they be getting ready to change formats? No, they're not getting ready to change formats. I guess that's just bumper music.
24, I could not have imagined.
And this has the old defective output tube back in it. That's the reason we're hearing all this popping and carrying on. Now, I want to talk a minute about making an adapter to allow a more modern tube to work in place of this 41, which will not require any modifications to the radio. So the first thing we need to do is look up the pinout and the specifications for the type tube to be replaced, which of course is a type 41 in our case. And this is on the Radio Museum website, and they give us some other base designations that have the same electrical characteristics, supposedly. It's just a different base, and a 6K6 happens to be one of them, as does a 7B5 Loctile tube, as does a 6AR5, as well as an EL1. I'm not familiar with an EL1. That's probably some foreign tube. And a 6AR5 is a miniature tube. I thought it was, but I just had to look and see. Yes, 7-pin miniature tube. So, if for instance you don't have a 41, then possibly you have some of these other types. Of course, a 6K6G and a 6K6GT are both electrically the same, just a different envelope. 7B5, that's a Loctile tube. So, we go back to our 41, and we need to make a note of the pinout diagram for the 41. So we had the makings of a chart here. So our heater pins for the 41 are pins 1 and 6. The cathode is pin 5. The control grid, or G1, is pin 4. The screen grid, or G2, is pin 3. And the plate is pin 2. Now we need to look up the 6K6 and get the corresponding pin numbers for the same tube element. Okay, so on our 6K6, the heater pins are 2 and 7. Cathode is pin 8. Control grid, G1, is pin 5. Screen grid, G2, is pin 4. And plate is pin 3. So as you can tell there, none of the tube elements correspond to each other as far as having the exact same pin. So that's very important. So what you would do is, for example, on the 41 base, you would connect pin 1 on the 41 tube base to pin 2 on your octal socket, and then pin 6 on the 41 tube base to pin 7 on your octal socket, etc. And when determining what pin is what, when looking at the bottom of the tube for the 6K6, this is your keying pin between pins 1 and 8, and then you would go in a clockwise direction from the keying pin. For example, this pin here directly to the left of the keying pin is pin 1, and then you go up to pin 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And of course, they would line up in the same manner on the tube socket. Now, on a 41, there is no keying pin physically on the tube, but there will generally be an arrow between the two largest pins on the tube base, 1 and 6, which that's the heater pins, and you would still go in a clockwise direction from the arrow. The pin just to the left of the arrow will be pin 1, and then going around pin 2, pin 3, 4, 5, and then back around to 6. And of course, it's going to be a little bit tedious trying to get all the wires lined up and in their respective places, but keep the leads as short as possible, preferably short enough to where you can join the octal socket to the old tube base, and make sure the leads are insulated where they cannot short out to another lead inside of the tube base. And to get the old defective tube apart, there's a couple of ways you can go about it. The first way is the violent way, with just take a hammer and bust the glass carefully. Probably be better to wrap it up in something so you don't have glass fly everywhere, and then carefully remove all the guts. Or you can grab the tube bulb and the base, and if you're lucky, the glue will be old and about ready to let go anyway, so you can usually twist it really hard a few times, and it will usually come loose, and then you can heat up the pins with a soldering gun and usually pull the bulb off of the base without breaking anything, which the latter method is probably the safest way to go about it. And just for fun, I looked up a 6AQ5, which is a 7-pin miniature tube, and its octal equivalent would be a 6V6, and I believe its older pre-octal equivalent probably be a 42, although I'm not seeing it on here. Let me look up a 42 and see what... My 42 might be the older version of a 6F6. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so a 42 is the equivalent of a 6F6, which I have seen cases where a 6V6 was substituted for that tube, and it usually worked okay, but for our purpose, we're going to go with the proper equivalent. We'll either go with a 6K6 for our 41 or a 6AR5, whichever one I can find the easiest. And this sort of thing was done a lot, especially during World War II, when it was very hard to find repair parts for radios. If a technician needed a certain tube that was unavailable, then they would often make a tube adapter to allow the radio to be used with a tube that was more readily available. Okay, so when I look up a 6F6 directly, they list the 6V6 family as being a successor tube to the 6F6. So yeah, for all intents and purposes, a 6V and a 6F6 will generally interchange with each other. Well, I dug around in my junk and I found an octal tube socket, unfortunately a more modern variety that looks like some Chinese crap, and the terminals were all bent over, and as I was trying to straighten them out, a few of them broke off. Fortunately, there's enough left for me to solder to, unless they break off too. So once again, the cheap crap from China, that's the reason I try to stay away from that kind of junk and only buy parts from reputable sources, not the counterfeit garbage off of eBay and Amazon, etc. And as far as that original tube, it looks like I'm going to have to use some violence to get it apart, because the glue on that one is actually holding pretty strong. You know how it goes. If it's a tube that you don't want coming apart, that's the one that the glue is going to let go on. But if it's a tube that you want to get apart, then it's going to be stuck like Chuck forever. Alright, I've cleaned all of the glass and glue and guts out of the old base. I've done everything except for desoldering the connections, and whenever we're done, the tube socket will fit down into the old tube base just like that, and when we're done, we will epoxy it in place to make sure it stays there securely. Alright, this is how I'm doing this. I'm taking a piece of hookup wire, and on one end I'm stripping a short piece of insulation off to solder to the lugs on our octal tube socket, and then on the other end I'm stripping a very long piece of insulation off. That'll give us room enough to get everything situated in the base, and then the amount of insulation left will fill up the inner base of the tube there, and then once we get everything in and soldered, I can cut off the excess hookup wire, and I'm putting heat shrink tubing on each connection, since these socket pins, terminals, whatever, seem to be kind of flimsy. We don't want to take any chances of anything shorting to each other. Alright, I've got all of my wires attached to the pertinent pins on the octal socket. Pins 1 and 6 are not used, so now we're ready to try to route everything into our base, and hopefully we can do so without this wire breaking, or one of the pins breaking off of the tube socket. Alright, here's our chart, and this is not the time to make a careless mistake. Not even one. Alright, we have every wire in its respective position, and I bent everything back to keep it from pulling out from the pins of the base. Now we'll shove everything in here and get it manipulated and hope it works. It should. Well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to redo my insulation because there was too much of it, making it harder to ram all this down in there. So we're going to have to be a little bit more careful with that and hope nothing breaks, because when you're dealing with cheap tube sockets and cheap wire, then, well, cheap made wire, not such a cheap price though. Most of the ones that I saw built from back in the day from repair shops, they were sitting up on stilts on heavy-duty bus wire. And the reason why is because it's nearly impossible to get everything down in here, especially when they don't line the pins up as in 1 for 1, 2 for 2, 3 for 3, etc. And you can't get everything in here without everything shorting out. So this one's going to get stuck up on stilts, and I don't care. Alright, I've got everything in here soldered up, excess wire trimmed off, epoxy in place, and no, it's not the 5-minute kind. So we're going to put a clamp on this, let it cure for 24 hours, and if any connection became compromised, as in broken or shorted after the fact, then that's just going to be the end of it, because it's going to be epoxied together, and I'm not going to try to bust into this thing. So either it works or it don't work. It would have been much easier and less time consuming to put the socket on stilts, but it wouldn't look nearly as neat, so it is what it is. Alright, here we are with the tube plugged into the adapter. I'm about to plug it in the radio, and we're going to see what happens. Okay, let's run the smoke test.
Deep left line, gets it left wing, a catch and shoot three off the left edge. And the weak side rebound to Hubbard for Mississippi State. Trying to shake free from Thomas.
Oh, it's working.
To Matthews, drives to the logo. Matthews.
And of course we have to get our mumble black gospel on.
Tom. So, Coach Williams State shooting 62%.
With a wind at 10 miles per hour coming out of the southwest and a low of 53. Tomorrow morning, look for a gentle breeze and sunshine with a temperature.
I scan across the AM dial, and I sometimes wonder why I even bother fixing these things.
You have this right, Coach. Well, Rob, do you think that could actually work against him?
Gospel station, your good news gospel station.
When you own a business, it's anything but small. Severe, but the Bulldogs are turning them over now. They're converting in transition.
Hubbard at the line for three.
And another source of noise I just found is this IF transformer can is loose, and whenever I touch it, it started acting stupid. So we had the audio output tube that was intermittently shorted. We had these connections on the volume control, and then the IF transformer, and what's happening there is the shield around the transformer is not making good connection with the chassis because it's loose, and that can cause oscillation and undesirable crap too. So let's tighten down these look like 1/4-inch nuts here that hold this transformer in place. Okay, so the reason the IF transformer was loose is because the nuts were jacked up. One of them especially. The other one I was sort of able to get it tightened down, but just to make a secure bond, I sanded down a portion of the can and the chassis and put a little bit of solder on that to make the connection secure. Because like I said, this shield not only has to shield the IF transformer, but the shield has to make connection with the chassis. And the same goes for any tube shields. They have to not only shield the tube, they have to make contact with the chassis, or otherwise you're going to have all kind of undesirable results. So let's see if this thing's going to behave any better.
65.
Alright, now when I tap the IF transformer, it behaves. There's nothing going berserk now, so I'm just going to let it play a while, see how it does, and then we're going to call it done until the time comes I decide to pull this back apart and give it a proper going over, but at least right now it will do pretty good for our local stations for whatever that's worth. Okay, we're on WSM, playing some decent music for this radio. Turn that down, we don't need no copyright crap, but it seems to be doing pretty good, so I guess with that I'm going to call it a day and say happy 2025 to everybody. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm just now getting used to the 1990s, and here it is, 2025 looming up on us. So, with that, I'll say good night, and more to come later.